Well, good afternoon, everyone. It's 2 o'clock, so time for me to open this hearing session concerning the Old Oakham Park Royal Development Corporation local plan modifications. I think all the participants are the same as this morning, or is nobody new, so I won't go through the formalities again, except to remind you, of course, that the meeting is being recorded and streamed, and so if you don't want your image or voice to be recorded for posterity, then you need to switch off your camera or microphone respectively, but you can continue to watch the proceedings. Okay, so this morning we had a session on PTALs, and I forgot to close the meeting by thanking everyone who participated, but as you're all here anyway, you can take it. You can take my thanks now. This afternoon we're going to be dealing with the question of whether the plan conforms with the London Plan Policy D9 on tall buildings. So this is a point that was raised by the Old Oak and Woodlands neighbourhood forums. So technically the plural forum is for that. The arguments are set out in their representations, 117 through to 128, and also in more detail at 117.43 and 117.111. And they make the point that the intervention by the Secretary of State in the London Plan was not anticipated and post-dated much of the work undertaken by the OPDC in preparing its modifications. Now, in response to that, the corporation points out that the Mayor has confirmed that the local plan is in general conformity with the London Plan in its respect of its approach to tall buildings, but the two neighbourhood fora don't see that as being the end of the story, because in the period since the 2021 London Plan was adopted, with its new policy D9, there have been a number of questions and potential challenges raised across London over the interpretation of the plan by GLA officers. And this includes occasions when mayoral decisions are made on individual applications. And many amenity and resident groups have concerns that the interpretation by GLA officers doesn't properly reflect the intent of the Secretary of State's direction, nor the plain wording of the modified and strengthened policy. Now, at the time the two fora made their representations, the outcome of the application made by Hillingdon against the Mayor's decision on the application at the former Master Brewer site, Friesland Way, wasn't known. It is now. And the fora say that the case will have implications for local plans and decision making on applications across London. And I think we've had other cases as well, appeal cases, which have also given us some illumination on the way the policy should be interpreted. So the new London Plan was formally adopted March 2nd, 2021, and the two fora representations set out what the policy says, and they also quote the covering letter from the Secretary of State that was sent with his direction. So the two neighbourhood fora say they see no sign that the modifications to the OPDC's local plan, they say that they see no sign that it paid adequate heed to that direction or to its acceptance by the Mayor as a modification to the 2021 London Plan. And they say that GLA officer comments in reports on planning development unit report subsequent to March 2021 interpret the plan incorrectly in their view. They accept that the modifications include maps which identify reasonably specifically locations for tall buildings, for example in scrub lanes, and permissions for such buildings have already been issued. But they consider that the way the modifications indicate further locations, for example in Channel Gate and North Acton, are not specific enough to qualify as compliant with the London plan. So that's the first point. Then the second point is that appropriate heights are not defined in the modifications, other than in some references to 6 to 8 stories along the Grand Union Canal, and very generic terms in a tall building statement, which is a supporting document to the development plan. It's not the development plan itself. And so they feel this is rather misleading because it doesn't give the public, or indeed developers, any indication as to the heights which the modifications are entertaining. They say that the intention of the Secretary of State in his direction was very clear, and they claim that the modifications are subverted by a local plan which avoids giving the public clear information on the housing densities and building heights likely to flow from its policies. So I think we now know, I set out 5 matters for discussion, but I think we now know, don't we, that the court case has reached a conclusion, and there are copies of it distributed around. I'm not sure, are they, has that reached the website yet? I think it has, yes. Peter's nodding. Yeah, there it is, Master Brewer site decision, it's OSD 57. So first thing, does that court case confirm or dispel the view that the modifications don't comply with the London plan? I guess I'm going to let Henry Peterson comment on this first, because this was a point that he raised in the first place, and now you've got the decision, Henry. Does it help you or not?
Thank you, Inspector. Yeah, no, we had hoped that the Hillingdon case would give some definitive judgment on the interpretation of D9, but it does not, in our view, help very much. It deals with a specific planning application for an 11-storey building, and the judge was firm that the context was critical to interpretation in this case, and ended up concluding that partial non-compliance with D9 didn't render the mayor's decision unlawful, taking into account the planning balance and the Hillingdon development plan. So we don't think it helps us much. The judge didn't even address the issue of appropriate tall buildings and the need for appropriate heights to be identified on maps in a development plan. So if you look at paragraph 81 of the judgment, she oddly admits those words, appropriate tall building height. Nor does she explore the question of whether the wording of D9B, which refers specifically to development plans, should be extended to include non-statutory documents, including SPDs. I mean, that's a fairly simple issue for you to resolve, and I mean, we will accept your verdict, but my firm understanding is that SPDs and supporting statements are not part of the development plan, and that the wording in D9 is very clear that it's in development plans that the Secretary of State expects to see this information. So Mrs. Justice Lang decided not to refer to the letter and direction overview from Robert Jenrick, and I think talking to a lot of others, people find that strange. I mean, Secretary of States don't issue directions that often. They don't modify London plans late in the stage that often. And we see his intervention as following a clear path going back to the Better Building Beautiful Commission, to the creation of the Office of Place, to the setting up of that, to the National Model Design Code, to the emphasis on gentle density in London. And like many groups and forums in London, we work with Create Streets. We listen to the views of Nicholas Boyd Smith, influential on Government Department, MHCLG, and now DHLUC. And we thought that that intervention meant something very real, and that it would result in protecting people from very tall buildings, except where a local plan is very clear as to where they should be and what are the appropriate heights. I think it's generally recognised that D9 puts the responsibility on local plans rather than the London plan, and Robert Jenrick was clear that if locally boroughs and LPAs such as OPDC want to have tall buildings, fine. It's not a ban on tall buildings across London, but it is saying they've got to be clear and identified in a local plan and in the development plan. And we simply don't think that the currently modified OPDC local plan gets even close to doing that at the moment. Could do, no doubt, with further modifications, but doesn't do in its current version. So that's our basic position.
Okay, thanks for that. Perhaps I should make one thing clear. Elsewhere in this examination, I have told the OPDC that policy must be in policy, not in supporting justification, not in development plan, not in supplementary planning documents. So I think all inspectors are quite clear about that. Supplementary planning documents are not the development plan, and policy should be in the development plan as a policy, if it is to be policy. Everything else is just guidance or argument or supporting evidence. It's not actually statutory policy. So quite clear about that. However, interestingly enough, I don't know whether you or Robin, Mr. Peterson, but someone has provided me with this excellent document which analyses the extent to which London plans comply with policy D9. Was that you, Henry?
Yes. I mean, that's become quite a widely circulated document amongst London amenity groups. I mean, we liaise closely with the London Forum of Civic Societies. Michael Bach, who chairs its Planning and Transport Committee, is a colleague of mine on the Kensington Society as a trustee. I mean, he's an ex-civil servant from DOE days, knows every London plan from the year 2000 onwards in detail, and I've discussed this issue with them. It became an issue in Kensington, where a tall building, in Kensington's terms, featured. We took advice from Landmark Chambers, as it happens, on the interpretation of D9. That led to a pre-action protocol letter, because we felt the council was ignoring D9 in its planning officer reports. That in turn led to the report being completely redrafted, the planning committee reconvened and making a fresh decision. I mean, on planning balance, and this was only a 9-storey building, and there were other sort of heritage issues involved, they made the same decision again, but they recognised the force of the written advice that we had from Landmark Chambers, and they recognised that to conform with D9, it is necessary to address location, appropriate height and suitability, and so forth. So we stick to the simple wording of D9B. As in the Hillingdon case, I mean, when you get into D9C, that's a set of criteria whereby you might assess suitability. But D9B is very, very clear. It says any such locations and appropriate tall building heights should be identified on maps in development plans, and tall buildings should only be developed in locations that are identified as suitable. It doesn't say should generally be developed in locations or should ideally be developed in locations. It says should only be developed in locations. And I know there have been differing views on D9, and I suspect it will be tested in the courts on future occasions. And as you say, it is surfacing in inspector decisions on appeals at the moment. But I mean, I think this may be the first new London local plan that has to grapple with this issue. That GLA document you refer to looks at every borough's local plan in terms of conformity. Many clearly do not conform at present, and those LPAs are going to have to come up with good justification if they are in future granting planning consents to tall buildings in locations that they have not identified or said inappropriate or whatever, or if they've said nothing about building heights in their local plan. But I mean, that's a question for them. This is a brand new, high-profile London local plan, and it will be watched in terms of how D9 is incorporated and interpreted, and it'll be watched in terms of the inspectorate view on that. And I fully accept that these matters may end up in the courts to make a final determination. But at the moment, we are going with views that were expressed back in February by Russell Harris QC at a Landmark Chambers webinar that, again, quite a lot of Londoners have seen and viewed. And he was very clear in his view. This was a significant change towards re-emphasising the need for positive plan-led approach to identifying suitable sites. And that's what the MPPF accepts in terms of a plan-led approach. And it's not the same as the old 7.7 in the previous London plan, which more or less said anything goes in an opportunity area and so forth. It is a new policy, not been discussed at this examination before. So we think this will be an outcome that's looked at by a lot of people across London.
Okay, thanks for that. There's a couple of things I want to ask you about that, but before I do, let's hear from Andrew Slaughter, who's got his hand up there. Mr. Slaughter.
I don't want to interrupt the flow of the meeting again. I'm apologise for being here and then not there. But if you're happy, I'll make an inexpert but a mercifully brief contribution, if I may, on this issue. I was taken by the comment this morning in relation to the substantial targets for house building in London and the part that OPDC needs to play in that. I agree with what Mr. Peterson has just said. I don't feel that the modified scheme is plan led. I feel it's effectively making best use of what land is left now that a substantial part of the land, i.e. the car giant land, has been withdrawn, and that has brought with it certain significant problems. Can I just be very clear? Nothing is more important to me than new housing development. I spent 35 years in Hampshire and Fulham since I was first elected, trying to get more housing built that's of a good standard, with two caveats. Firstly, what is the type of housing? And it's affordable housing that is essentially needed. It isn't more small, expensive units which are mainly for sale overseas, which we have coming out of our ears at every end of the borough. And the second is where there is development, and why I've always had some scepticism about the 25,000 target. We're effectively building new districts of London here. That's what the developers always tell us, and that's completely right. And I think Old Oak North did aspire to be that. I see nothing that aspires to be a new district. And we've had very bad experiences over the last 10 to 15 years with the opportunity area developments. We've got the Earls Court development that has been stalled for 10 years, one opportunity area, the White City development, which has some very good aspects to it, Imperial College, Westfield, commercial development and academic, but that has come up because of decisions by those corporations. The housing development in the White City area I got with despair, because it's almost all high-rise, featureless, for sale overseas, very little affordable housing available. And now we have the opportunity to do something in Old Oak. And I hope that's what we were getting towards with the previous scheme. Instead, what we have, the proposal is, it's already there in outline at North Acton, and it looks like we're going to get more of that. Very, very tall buildings, residential, similar to what I've just described. And that is not creating places, it's not creating new districts of London, it's not creating the housing that I think that people need. That's the concerns that my constituents have, and what I feel very passionately about. So yes, I want to see the maximum amount of housing built as part of OPDC that is commensurate with those two principles, that it is useful housing, it's decent quality housing for people in housing need, and secondly, that it's place shaping, it creates a new. I don't see that. It was integral to that we had the transport system we were talking about this morning, where you had that, and I think we're losing that as well. And it's also integral to that we're not losing the economic drivers that we have previously. Obviously, the problem with Car Giant being turned into residential was that you would have lost that industrial and commercial space, but it was to be replaced. Now that's gone, that's fallen through, at least for the foreseeable future. And you'll talk tomorrow about, and I don't know if I can do this tomorrow, you'll talk tomorrow about sustaining the economic side of OPDC, which is mainly was going to be Park Royal. And again, there's a query now that the residential development is going mainly into Ealing that way. So what I'm seeing on the Hammersmith side, which is all I'm qualified to talk about, individual projects like the tall buildings being built, not very tall, but tall buildings being proposed to be built down Scrubs Lane, which are actually potentially seeing a loss of community space, are built, I think, in a way that doesn't pay attention to what is happening at the Grenfell inquiry, because they're based on the same principle of design, i.e. Single building, single staircase buildings of a similar height to Grenfell in that way, and I'm very concerned about the building safety aspects of this as well. And I don't feel that these points have been properly taken into consideration. And I certainly don't feel that what is now being proposed with the Imperial planning application coming forward for 4 50-storey plus buildings on that small area in North Acton is something that is appropriate for this part of London at all. I will stop there. I could say more, but I'll stop there.
Yeah. Thank you very much, Mr. Swallow. I can see Mr. Brown wants to speak, and I'll come to you in a minute, Robin. But as Mr. Slaughter is with us, there is something I'd like to discuss with you, if you've got the time, which is this: you've obviously spent a lot of your career specialising in housing matters. So there's one thing that I've heard argued. You mentioned briefly the mix of dwellings. That's not something that we were. It's not something that we put on the agenda here today. But as you're here and as you mentioned it, can I talk to you about it? Because I can't remember if it was in this examination or in another examination that I've been dealing with, but the argument has been put to me, and I'd be interested to hear what you think of this argument. The argument has been put to me something along these lines, that money will out, and the people who want to rent or buy small dwellings, 1 and 2 bedroom flats, if they can't get them, they will club together and share family housing, and that leads either to a a pressure for conversion of what is otherwise housing perfectly suited to families, and you lose it to conversions, or they simply multi-occupy it. They share it on a multi-occupancy basis, which produces poor living standards for them and still loses you the family housing. And so the argument goes that because those people have the power of the pound, they can buy their way into the housing market and get what they want. The best way of dealing with the situation is to cater for their needs, build them all the small flats that they want, and that way you manage to preserve the family housing which exists for the families that it's designed for. What's your view on that argument?
I think that's a counsel of despair. I mean, the areas we're talking about were built mainly in the Victorian Edwardian period. They were for expansion. They're not suburban areas. They're city areas, but nevertheless they were built for housing families, and often alongside other small commercial developments, market gardens, things of that kind. All right, those days have gone. There is an element. I can see the force of the argument you put in relation to, say, student housing, because we have a high student population, and we're very proud of having Imperial locally with the new campus at White City. They have a great demand for student accommodation. That's true of the hospitals as well. There is. You're quite right that what is happening in some cases is that families are being priced out because 4 or 5 students can share a 3-bedroomed Victorian terraced house. There are ways, I think, of dealing with the issue of multi-occupancy, i.e. through regulation, if they are unregulated, which partly deal with that issue. But certainly, and Imperial are addressing this to a large extent, building accommodation blocks, which is what they've done in White City and elsewhere, and on the Hammersmith Hospital campus, effectively deals with that point. I don't accept that point as regards to the population more generally, and I don't think, in my experience, that is what is happening. Either flats are being bought as investments and left empty, or for very occasional use. If it's somebody who has several properties and might use a property here because it's a very convenient location between the Heathrow and the city, or people, if they can afford it, who like it because it's a new luxury apartment in that way. I don't see much. We're talking about 1-2 bedroom flats here on the whole, I think. I don't see much sign of that being used for multi-occupancy. Now, there may be an element of that with the pocket living. I've got reservations about pocket living as well. We've also got co-living being developed. So I think there are alternatives. There, if you like, for that part of the market, there are some pretty inadequate housing, but still sort of there are options there. What isn't being provided is for all income range, but particularly for moderate income or just above or just below moderate income range, is ordinary family housing, and we have to be able to provide that. And I think the mayor's policies do try and deliver that. I don't see much sign of that having been delivered in the opportunity areas. I think the problem that arises is clearly one of affordability relating to the cost of development. And that was clearly an issue in relation to Old Oak North, for example, where one would have needed quite a subvention of public funds in order to make that successful. But that is what is needed, and that is clearly what has been lacking for some years. But it won't be lacking forever. What I don't want to happen is for us to build, I wouldn't call them the slums of the future, but the white elephants of the future. And that's what I see being built here. 50-story residential blocks, not student accommodation, not for any specific use, but simply as general accommodation for purchase in that way. They're not going to be cheap. They're not going to be suitable for most people who want to live and form a community in the area. And I just see that as totally unsuitable for what are primarily residential areas like this, and they just have to look at the skyline. The skyline has changed dramatically within 5 years, and I don't know a single person who has come to me and said, I like what they're doing at North Acton. I like what they're doing in Scrubs Lane. That's what we want to see. We want to see more blocks like Grenfell Tower. We want to see more 50-story skyscrapers everywhere. It's as though a collective madness has overtaken the planners, and the developers, as always, will make hay.
Thank you for that. I should lay my cards on the table and confess that I am a buy-to-let landlord, as well as the father of 2 children who are trying to get onto the housing ladder and buy a family house. So I have interest in both ends of the market. Thank you very much for that contribution. Can I now turn to Robin? And it was a digression, and I apologise to everybody else for straying off the agenda. But as Mr. Slaughter was here, I thought I'd tap his expertise.
I thank you so again for your indulgence, and I will leave you in peace for a short while I go and Zoom elsewhere. Thank you.
Right. Okay. Thank you very much, Mr. Brown. Robin Brown.
Thank you, and I hope I won't add to potential divergences, but I want to pick up on a point you made earlier in the introduction about Secretary of State's direction was unexpected. Well, that's probably true in terms of the public not expecting it, but the heritage, the origin of London Plan Policy D9 was clearly signposted much earlier. For example, in the July 2019 tidying up version of the draft London Plan by the GLA, the policy is clearly set out there. The only difference between then and now is the addition of the phrase around 6 stories introduced by the Secretary of State's direction. So the OPDC has had clear and quite lengthy warning that they needed to attend, that they needed to address London Plan Policy D9, even though it was only adopted in March last year. And also, so that July 2019 version of the draft London Plan is a matter of public record, as is the panel of inspectors report, which in my eyes glowingly endorsed London Plan Policy D9. Thank you.
Thank you, Robin.
Okay.
Okay, now what I'd like to do, I mean, I don't know if the OPDC wants to make any particular comment at this stage, but what I would like to do is to have a look at this document that Henry Peterson has provided us with, showing London Borough's compliance with Policy D9. Emma Williamson first.
This comment, just so that we don't forget and it isn't left hanging. So,
sorry, say that again.
would you mind if I came back on some of Andy Slaughter's points so we don't leave it hanging and forget those from our perspective? I just wanted to make it clear that it isn't our intention to build slums. That our intention is very high quality placemaking, and I think Pete will probably talk about that a bit more in a minute. We're not proposing 50-story buildings everywhere, and I just want to make clear that the capacities that we've got in the site allocations are not predicated on those heights. And I also just wanted to agree with you that it is our experience as a planning authority, as you say, about single households occupying family units when there isn't enough kind of 1 and 2 bed units, and that there is actually still a need to build 1 and 2 bed units for both, because there is also a need for new family housing. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much. Richard Moores.
Thank you, sir. I just wanted to say a couple of words about the master brewer decision, which will help frame the points that OPDC is going to make later on, if that's okay.
That would be helpful, yes.
Thank you. So I think that just as a route into this, if you've got the statement of common ground between OPDC and the GLA dated the 8th of December.
Yeah, I think I've got that somewhere. I think Peter told me the reference number earlier, didn't you?
It's OPDC, I think 46.
46, thank you. Oh yeah, there it is.
Thank you. And if you go, sir, please, to page 3, we've got the heading Agreed Matters at the top of the page.
Yeah.
And then picking up at the foot in relation to tall building heights, one of the matters agreed is that because of the area's uniqueness, it would be beneficial to define appropriate tall building heights through a review of the local plan or DPD focused on this issue, which picks up the point that this isn't intended to be done by SPD. It will be done by either a review of the local plan or a DPD. Then over the page, this will be done within 3 years of adoption, and it's H that's particularly important, that prior to that, the GLA and OPDC have agreed that the MPPF, PPG, London Plan, including Policy D9, provide effectively development management tools to enable OPDC effectively to manage the delivery of appropriate building heights and design for tall buildings. And in my submission, the Master Brewer decision actually reinforces that point that's being made in the Statement of Common Ground, and I'll explain that now by going to the judgment.
Okay, first of all, I don't know if everybody else has had a chance to see the Statement of Common Ground that Richard Moores has referred to, but just in case you haven't, I will share it with you so that you can see the passages that he's been referring to. So he talked about paragraph F, which is there. And then he went on to G and H, which are there. Okay, right. So I hope that everybody can see what Mr. Moores has referred to. Would it help, Mr. Moores, if I also shared the judgment that we've had?
Thank you. That would be helpful. I'll start on the first page. So if you could have the bit with paragraph 1 on, please.
Yeah, I can do that. Yep, let's share that. I'll enlarge it because I think people have struggled to read it if I don't enlarge it. Is that legible? Does anyone find that too small? If you find that too small, can you put your hand up? Okay, no, everyone seems happy with that. Right, okay, Mr. Moore, off you go. Thank
you. So you can see, sir, as you've already said, from paragraph 1, this was a judicial review of a planning permission for an 11-storey building. Claimant was local planning authority, the defendant was the Mayor of London who granted the permission. If you could scroll down, please, to paragraph 4, Roman 1. Yep. This is the ground of challenge that's relevant here. So the claimant was alleging that the Mayor had misinterpreted policy D9, and the particular error that was being alleged was that the proposal conflicted with Part B of policy B9 because it wasn't in an area identified as suitable for tall buildings, but the Mayor had gone on nonetheless to consider the proposal against the criteria in Part C of policy D9, and Hillingdon's argument effectively was you don't get to Part C because you're not in an area identified in accordance with Part B, so you can't claim any policy support from Lim C of the policy. The detailed exposition of the claimant's argument is set out at paragraph 73, but if before we get to that, you could pick up paragraph 49 of the judgment, please, sir. Yep. There we go. Oh, that's not all of the paragraph, is it? Thank you. So what we've got at 49 is the judge setting out the revisions that were made to policy D9 following the Secretary of State's direction, and she's underlined in the quotation the bits that were changed in response to the direction. And you'll note that in relation to tall building heights at B2, there was no amendment made following the direction.
Yeah.
Then we get the claimant's submissions begin at paragraph 73. The judge quotes from their skeleton argument, and the conclusions are the important bit. It's paragraph 76.
There you go.
So first key point in paragraph 76, the interpretation of policy D9 is a matter of law for the court, and the judge has then decided in the following paragraphs what she should have regard to when interpreting the policy. And importantly, at paragraph 79, she says that the Secretary of State's direction to the mayor isn't a permissible aid to the construction of the policy. So that's paragraph 79. So that's following the well-established principles in the two cases she refers to in the previous two paragraphs. So in interpreting policy D9 according to the language used and in its context, but not by resort to extrinsic aids such as the direction, she reaches the view at paragraph 80 through to 82 that the claimant's submissions were incorrect. She says at 82 there's no wording which indicates that part A or B of policy D9 are a gateway into part C. And then in 83 through to 85, she says that the context here is that the drafter of the policy must have well known that planning permission could be granted for a tall building, notwithstanding a conflict with D9, if other parts of the development plan and other material considerations justified that. And the claimant's submission effectively would lead to assessing the merits of tall buildings in a vacuum. A much more sensible interpretation would be to use the criteria in limb C of the policy together with the framework and other aspects of the development plan. So even if you're not in an area that's identified as being suitable under limb B, or I would add, even if you're in an area such as OPDC where it's premature to set building heights, you still have development control through the application of the criteria in limb C, the rest of the development plan and national policy.
Yeah.
So that's what I wanted to say about Master Brewer, and I think that frames the points that OPDC are going to make later on about the statement of common ground and why the approach they've taken is justified. So unless I can help you any further on Master Brewer, perhaps if we dive into the issues that you wanted to explore.
Yeah, that is helpful. And I don't know if anybody else has seen it, but there was also reported in Planning magazine a week or so ago, a decision by one of my colleagues,
Inspector Griffiths, yeah,
in Enfield, the Southgate office village development, and he seems to have taken pretty much the same line. There's a quote that is recorded. Where is it? Yeah, this is the report in the Planning magazine. On his reading, that is Paul Griffiths' reading, it was not clear whether the London plan policy limited tall buildings to locations that had been identified through a development plan, or allowed for tall buildings to come forward wherever their impacts could be shown to be acceptable. The inspector favoured the latter interpretation, given the housing crisis in London and the time it took for local plans to be adopted. So it seems to be and it goes on to say the inspector ultimately determines that whilst the proposal was in conflict with the London Plan tall buildings policy, it was in accordance with the development plan read as a whole. So that seems to be somewhat similar to what is being said in the court case that we've just looked at.
It is. So I've read that decision letter, and the inspector's interpretation is on all fours with what the judge decided subsequently, effectively for the same reasons.
Good. Now, I want to go on to, well, before we go on to my matter 2 for discussion, I want to have a look at this document that Henry Peterson has provided us with, which is this report that he referred to. And while and before I forget it, Mr. Peterson, you referred to legal advice which caused, was it Kensington and Chelsea to change their mind on a particular case? I'm afraid I didn't manage to note down exactly what you said there.
It was a Kensington and Chelsea case where, as I say, we took legal advice from Landmark Chambers. They wrote a pre-action protocol letter challenging the decision of the planning committee. Having taken their own legal advice, the council then reconvened the committee, had a fresh report making a different set of arguments and referring to D9 in detail, which they had failed to do previously. So that was the case.
Right. Thank you. Thank you. I've got that written down now. Anyway, this document that you sent in was, well, I found interesting because it asked a series of questions. It was a survey of London boroughs. It asked a series of questions, and then it tabulates the answers or the responses received. I'm not sure, it doesn't say within itself what level of response there was. So I don't know how in percentage terms how much they've covered all the local plans adopted in London. I quick above checked. I noted that there's a few action area plans which I have examined which aren't listed here, but of course action area plans tend to be short-lived and of course don't cover the whole borough. So, but with that qualification, it does seem to be a fairly comprehensive survey. I don't know if anybody has any further information about that, but looking at it, of the 8 questions, it looks as though questions 1 to 5 really cover policy compliance with policy D9, and questions 6, 7, and 8 are as it were contextual questions. And then analysing these, question 1, does the development plan have a definition of a tall building for all or parts of the borough? It looked as though most of the responses said yes, not all of them. Question 2, does the tall buildings definition meet the policy requirement of not being less than 6 stories or 18 metres measured from ground to the floor level of the upper lower story? And is it given in height in metres or stories, or is it subjective? Again, there seem to be a majority of yeses rather than nos. And question 3 referred to policy D9 part 1, part B1. Has the borough identified locations where tall buildings may be appropriate? Again, although this first page has a lot of no's in that column, most of the responses were yes. But then it gets interesting. Question 4, part B2, in identified tall building location, is there a maximum or appropriate height for tall buildings? And there are 92 entries in this survey, and 58 said no. So about 60% of all the responses are that they don't comply with that part of the London Plan policy in question D9. And then question 5, does the development plan restrict tall building development to locations that are identified with the plan as suitable? The vast majority answered no. And I found that quite an interesting analysis, because it puts the OPDC's compliance or otherwise into context. Now, so let's move on, if we can, to have a look at the questions I asked. So to what extent does the London Plan Policy DP9 require specific or generalized locations to be defined? Because as I understand it, Henry Peterson, your comment is that you accept that the modifications give fairly specific locations on Sclubbs Lane, but the other locations are fairly generalized, and your contention is they're not specific enough. And so I suppose really the question I want discussed here is, well, does the London Plan Policy how require a very specific location, or is a generalized location adequate? Now, so I think what I'd like to do is now hear from the OPDC on that question, and then I'll come back to you, Mr. Peterson, and to Mr. Brown. So let's hear from the OPDC first. Richard Mools, who are you going to nominate to give that?
Thank you. It'll be Mr. Farnham dealing with all of the matters this afternoon, taking the lead on them.
Okay. Right then, so Peter, it's off to you.
Great, thanks Richard, thanks Inspector. So I'm going to take you through some 5 points in relation to this. There's a bit of overlap between the locations and the heights, but there is a distinction between as well. So the first point I'm going to talk about is an explanation as to why the OPDC area is unique within London and how this is relevant to the local plan's phased approach to defining tall building information and guidance. The second one is confirmation that the London Plan does not specify whether tall building location should be specific or general, and will provide examples of some other local planning authority, local plans as well. And then short confirmation that the approach we've undertaken is really being utilised and is being effective in forming the location of implemented tall building proposals as well. And then I'll round things off with a short conclusion. So with regards to uniqueness, GLA and OPDC consider that OPD's approach is in general conformity with the London Plan, and again that's referenced in our statement of common ground with them, as we've already previously referenced. The OPDC area is unique from other London local planning authorities. This uniqueness requires a phased approach to producing planning guidance for tall buildings that aligns with the progression of London's largest regeneration project. And this uniqueness is demonstrated by a combination of the following elements I'll be going through. The first one is that the position at the very start of a long-term 30-year plus development programme, which involves over 91 hectares of developable publicly and privately owned land. Secondly, the development potential and scale of complexity involving large strategic sites that are yet to be master planned or designed. Then there's the exact configuration of the future movement network, the location of new open spaces, the sizes, layout and shapes of future development sites and schemes that have yet to be defined. So all of this comes together as demonstrating an extensive, evolving development context that would be subject to significant change. This in itself reflects the area being wholly designated as an opportunity area, and it's an opportunity area that's positioned at the meeting point of not one but 2 London Plan growth corridors for the Heathrow Elizabeth line and High Speed 2 and Thames link. And that in itself reflects the future unparalleled connectivity provided by the Old Common Station, which will be the gateway to London, Midlands and the North as well. So with that in mind, OPDC and the GLA consider that defining general tall building locations at this point in time and with the intention of defining appropriate building heights within OPDC's development plan within 3 years, set out in the Statement of Common Ground, is appropriate. This reflects the long-standing proposal in the tall building statement to provide building heights guidance in future versions. With regard to specific and general locations, as I said, the London plan doesn't set these out. The OPDC's local plan figure 3.15, which supports policy SP9, provides generalised boundaries on an OS base map at an OPDC area-wide scale for areas where tall buildings may be an appropriate form of development. There's also place policy wording that provides further detailed guidance for the location of these tall buildings alongside general building heights, which I'll come on to shortly. So we consider this provides an accessible approach to all users of the local plan. I'll move on to a couple of examples of how this plays out. So we're familiar with these sites. One of them is Channel Gates. Just for a bit of recollection, it's a large 18-hectare site, and it's where we've identified significant development. But it's where specific locations of movement routes, open spaces, and the retained and re-provided freight and industrial uses are yet to be defined. General locations are indicated alongside an area search for a local park. However, these are not fixed, and there needs to be an appropriate degree of flexibility for where tall buildings may be located. Therefore, the channel gates, as with other areas, generalised areas are shown to reflect where development plots will likely come forward and respond to sensitive locations. At a more smaller scale, we have the laundry cluster on Scrubs Lane to the north of Scrubs Lane. Relevant policy is P10C2. This policy safeguards a potential access route to Old Oak North. Although the local plan recognises a route may be required, the specific alignment and location have yet to be defined. The alignment and location of the route will inform the location of the tall building in this area and could be delivered on 1 or 2 sites. Therefore, a generalised location is required to reflect the evolving context. Moving on to approaches other local planning authorities have undertaken, and there is some crossover with the table we've referenced previously with some updates since then. I'm going to select a few examples of how other local planning authorities are showing tall building locations. Hounslow currently showing them as generalised locations, as does Lambeth. Brent shows more specific locations. The London Legacy Development Corporation shows both generalised and specific locations reflecting the progression of their development programme. And then we have tall buildings show specific locations. It should be noted that the majority of tall building locations tend to be large in size, with many local plans referring to opportunity areas or town centres being appropriate for tall building locations. Moving on to my fourth point, with regards to effective application of our approach. So since we first published OPDC's tall building locations, we've been successful in managing the location of tall buildings to the locations identified in the local plan delivery sites. These include some implemented schemes at Mighty Yard and North Kensington Gate on Scrubs Lane, alongside others including First Central. So this really demonstrates that on the ground, the current approach is effective to guiding locations of tall buildings. So to sum it up, we consider that our approach to showing tall buildings on maps meets the requirements of policy D9, and that both ourselves and the GLA consider it our approach to be in general conformity with the London plan.
Thank you very much, Peter. Henry Peterson, you've got your hand up first, I think. You're muted, Henry, you're muted.
Yep. So just to respond to all of those points, the generalised, I suppose, locations, it may be a court of law that ultimately decides this. We're going with plain English. Location does not mean an area on a map of the size of North Acton, 39 hectares, or Channel Gate at 18 hectares. A location is a more precise geographical point than that. Otherwise, B in D9 would not make a lot of sense. On the uniqueness argument, we don't see that that has any force at all. Were these local plans to be coming forward from Ealing, Brent and Hammersmith, as they would have been, as individual boroughs, if the OPDC hadn't existed, they would be dealing with the same areas of public land, railway land, brownfield land, have all the same issues to grapple with. But I don't think the Inspectorate would be happy to see, well, perhaps presumptuous of me, but I don't see why those individual boroughs would be excused for meeting D9 in the London plan on the basis of uniqueness. King's Cross, LLDC area, there have been plenty of other examples. Your general point that if you look at that London table, you're quite right that the majority of current local plans do not conform. Many of them date back to 2012, 2015, are in the process of review. Kensington and Chelsea is reviewing its local plan for the second time in recent years. And we're very clear that that is going to have to identify suitable locations and appropriate heights in its local plan. And until that happens, developers may have to wait a bit. So we don't accept that just because the status quo is an absence of conformity by many London boroughs, that it is the intention of the Secretary of State that that should continue to be the position. I mean, other additions to the MPPF reinforce that direction of travel of delegation to individual planning authorities on tall buildings, but with a message of gentle density, going with what the public find acceptable, going with the National Model Design Code, none of the examples of which bear any relation to what is now going on at North Acton and so forth. On the point 4, the effective operation of the approach to date, we would continue to argue that what's happened in Scrubs Lane from day one has been developer-led planning. Those are sites identified, purchased by developers for development at the very early stages of the Old Oak Park thinking. It is not the result of careful planning by OPDC to create that series of clusters. The new ones being added are part of a search for any other possible sites. Yeah, the second point. No, I think that, those are the main points. We fully accept that London local plans are not in a fit state to conform as yet. The GLC, when the policy came into force in March, we were not alone, and I think again Russell Harris QC has said GLC planners were a bit mystified because a lot of it looked the same as before, but the addition of the word suitable had significant legal impact in Part B3, and that wasn't fully recognised. And the initial sequence of decisions that came out of the Planning Decisions Unit at the GLA, a lot of people felt they were not taking account of D9 sufficiently. Not all areas, boroughs, groups can mount judicial reviews. So I say, I don't think the Hillingdon case has answered the point. And just to go back briefly to what Council was saying on that, the issue about Part C and whether Part B is a gateway, we fully accept Part C is a set of assessment criteria for suitability, but we maintain Part B stands on its own very clearly, unambiguously. Tall buildings should only be developed in locations that are identified as suitable in development plans. I can't see how you can get clearer than that in terms of the London plan. The Enfield example, we have noted that too, and we've discussed that with colleagues again at the London Forum. We think that's a bold decision by the Inspector. I mean, if that is going to become the settled view of the Inspectorate, that there is ambiguity in D9B, I think that's going to be interesting in future, because I think there are a lot of people and a lot of groups and a lot of amenity societies in London who will take a different view. So as I say, because this is maybe the first local plan examination which has to grapple with this issue, there may be others coming through the system in London that I don't know of, but we do think this will be watched very closely, and that a decision on the interpretation of how D9 should feature in a local plan needs to be very clear. There is nothing in the current version, if somebody reads it, that says there'll be a 28-storey building on the canal side at Channelgate, and yet that is happening. There is nothing that says there'll be 50-storey buildings at North Acton, and yet the GLA itself has given pre-application advice to Imperial College, which says somehow that's okay by D9 on the basis of a very thin policy in the Ealing development sites DPD going back to 2013, 2014, that simply says North Acton, appropriate area for tall buildings, full stop. But that's enough to satisfy the GLA at the moment. We just don't think that's right, and that's not a proper interpretation of what is now in the London plan.
Okay, thank you for that. Thank you for that, Henry. Robin, you've got your hand up.
Thank you, sir. Perhaps I'll just run through various points, picking up on Henry's last point. The judge in the Hillingdon decision did say that the London Plan Policy D9 was expressed in clear and unambiguous terms, language that everyone could understand, both parties involved in the case. The GUA remains critical of the modifications regarding tall buildings. And to the earlier submissions, I would just like to ask, what is a tall building, the definition of a tall building? And it seems to me that the current definition within the draft local plan is rather simplistic and perfunctory, given that as Henry has noted earlier, how much more emphasis is now being given to design, the quality of design of buildings and their locations, the London plan itself, the new London plan, is encouraging design-led development. So, but I think a balance has to be struck between having an overcomplicated, one shouldn't have an overcomplicated policy. It has to be effective. It has to be clear. So maybe it would have to await a later review of the local plan to take that on board to nuance or enhance the current policy. But I would draw attention to the fact that tall buildings, the definition of what is tall depends very much on the context. And if we take the example of Wells House Road and look on the figures that have been produced, the maps of locations of tall buildings, we find that on 3 sides of Wells House Road are designated or proposed to be designated as suitable for tall buildings. And the 4th aspect from Wells House Road is looking out onto railway land. So I'm sure the residents of Wells House Road would define a tall building above their 2 or 3 story houses as something substantially lower than 15 stories. Moving on, there are advantages and benefits to local communities from a variable definition of tall buildings because we have in Part C the criteria tests of impacts and D public access. As I previously said, London Plan D9, there were early signposting signals that it was going to move towards adoption very early on. October 2019 was the sign off by the recommendation by the panel of inspectors. And the OPDC is able to do fine-grained context and character assessments and I'm not endorsing the recent application of that approach to the request by a neighbourhood forum to extend its territory, so to speak. But they have evidently the resources, including background documents, and there are a number of development framework principle documents, one of which, or two actually, the Channel Gate and the Victoria Road and Old Oak Lane development framework principles informed that context and character assessment. There are others that include Park Royal. So I'm suggesting that they had the time and they had the capability, the capacity to do a finer grained approach to this policy and the mapping of heights and locations. For me, just to conclude, I can find my notes. Yes, I think it could be reasonably argued that the areas on figure 315 are localities, but the policies require that locations and heights are set out on a development plan map. And for me, localities are sort of broader areas or neighborhoods, whereas a location for me is a particular position. So I sort of say yes and no as regards compliance or conformity with that particular London plan policy. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Robin. That's a helpful distinction to help me understand how you perceive the degree of compliance or not. Okay, right. Summing up on my second matter for discussion, it seems to me that what you're telling me is that it all turns on an interpretation of the meaning location. Henry, you said that you regard location, and Robin has made it clear as well that in your view, location is not a locality; it's a specific point. And so I've just got to take it seems to me that I've just got to take a view on what I understand by it. And that's probably as far as we can take that particular discussion, it seems to me, unless anybody has got anything else to say on the second matter for discussion in my agenda note. Peter Farnham, you've got your hand up first, and Mr. Moores, I suspect, would like to come in there as well. Peter, you're muted, Peter.
My AV assistant is helpfully unmuting me. So yes, no, I mean, I think just to reiterate the points or respond to the points that Robin talked about in terms of finer character, which could play into location versus locality. Even if we were to do finer grained detailed character assessment of areas subject to change, what we propose wouldn't change because the context will change, and we need that context to be further progressed through future master planning exercises before we can do meaningful, further detailed work for both locations and building heights. We have done a character assessment for across the whole of the OPDC, which is part of the examination library, and where we've got extensive areas of change, we've carried out those development framework principles as well.
Okay, thank you, Peter. And Mr. Moores, do you want to say some final words on my agenda item 2?
Just very briefly, that when construing those words, you'll obviously have regard to the context, and the Master Brewer decision shows that being outside an area on a location identified under Limb B2 isn't a moratorium on tall buildings, and so that wider context goes to how specific the location has to be. It's not a be all and end all whether you're in a policy B2 location or not.
Yes. Of course, Mr. Peterson will probably say, well, that contradicts the bit of the policy that says tall buildings can only be developed in locations that are identified as suitable. I suspect, but anyway, Henry Peterson, you've got your hand up. Is that?
Yeah, just very briefly, I would just concur with what you just said. I mean, there'd be no point in having B3 if location isn't specific. Peter's view Peter Farnham's view that it's too early to say seems to be simply an abrogation of the whole point of having a spatial plan and a local plan that is plan-led. OPD's policy to date has been largely to wait and see what comes up in terms of developer proposals coming forward, and then reacting to those in terms of retrospective development framework principle documents and the like. But the whole point of this surely is that local plans in future need to have that clarity. I mean, Mrs. Justice Lang did say at 67 on the Hillingdon case, the court will always keep in mind that the creation of development plan policy by a local planning authority is not an end in itself, but a means to the end of coherent and reasonably predictable decision-making in the public interest. We see Robert Jenrick's intervention as saying there has to be plan-led, predictable decision-making in the public interest on the future of tall buildings in London, and that what has happened to date is coming to an end with the National Model Design Code, with the Better Building Beautiful Commission, and so forth. That this period is one in which we move on from an era where tall buildings can be dotted around London at the whim of developers. And as I say, that's why this particular local plan examination is one that's going to be very important. And in making your decision as to what location means, I mean, we've looked at dictionaries, you can look at dictionaries, but we would hope perhaps you discuss with your colleagues, because it is going to be an important issue, and it wasn't one that the Hillingdon case addressed.
Okay, thank you for that. Right, I think I've had enough information, enough discussion on my second matter for discussion. We probably can't take that any further now. In terms of my third matter for discussion, the question of do the modified allocations adequately specify locations for tall buildings, I think there's a consensus among you that it does as far as the eastern side of the area is concerned, but not for the western side of the area. So it comes down to the localities rather than locations on the western side. So is that a fair summary? Henry Peterson's nodding his head. Yeah. Okay. So we probably don't need to discuss my item 3 any longer. So if everyone's agreed, can we move on to item 4? If anyone says otherwise, put your hand up. Right, item 4. To what extent do tall building heights require specification? Then we've got Henry Peterson and Robin Brown have quoted London Plan Policy D9B to any such locations and appropriate tall building heights should be identified. Now that's the phrase which you rely on, Henry. Is that right?
That's correct. I mean, in the submission that we made specifically for this session, we went to the somewhat tedious length for you to have to read of going through all the place sections in the post-submission modified plan and all the other documentation and we have set down everything that is said about appropriate heights. And as you mentioned earlier, on some occasions you will get a mention of a specific height, like 6 to 8 stories along the canal, or in this major street or whatever. Some occasions you get mentions up to 12 stories, but you never get a mention of anything above 12 stories that we've been able to find. So as I say, when the public now see a planning application coming forward for 28 stories in the pocket living scheme on the canal at Channelgate, or 56 stories at North Acton, how were they meant to know that those things were in the offing from reading the local plan, particularly a local plan that has individualized place chapters, which are not that large areas. They are localities, to use Robin's words. They are neighborhoods. They go into considerable detail about all sorts of other things, but what they don't do is say anything about the likely building heights. But this is in a plan where, as we have complained ever since the Regulation 18 version, the site allocations are specific on housing numbers for each site. The areas of those sites are known by OPDC. It is arithmetic to create a density figure as a result. I mean, Emma Williamson was saying earlier, we are not planning 50-story buildings at Channelgate. Well, how would we know, is my question, because it's pretty high density from crude arithmetic that we do ourselves, but the plan does not give the public the density figures, which allow for a reasonable guess as to whether you're talking 20 to 40-story buildings or 40 stories and above. It gives you nothing to go on in terms of likely appropriate heights. We can see no reason why the place policies should not be used as the vehicle for simply explaining to the public that given the need and given the housing demand and whatever, this is likely to lead to this place seeing buildings of 30 stories or 40 stories or 55 stories at North Acton. But that is simply avoided and has been avoided consistently since 2015, and we have raised it every single time we send in comments and representations, and we just don't see the difficulty. And as we read D9, that is what should now happen. Thank you.
The calculation that you've just described, the areas are known, the capacity is defined, so it ought to be possible to deduce some heights. Have you or your groups or any groups actually done that calculation and set out what heights you think would result from the information that there is in the plan?
We have frequently commented that when you get to densities of, say, 400 to 500 along Scrubs Lane, it is very likely you will get 20-story plus buildings, because it is not easy to achieve those sorts of densities without that building height. As Andy Slaughter has commented, that building typology of the residential tower has become entirely standard across London, but only since 1990. For a long period post Ronan Point, buildings of that type were not developed in London. We understand the relationship between density and building height. I mean, I trained as an architect in an era at Cambridge University where, I mean, that was the bread and butter of high density, low rise housing, and all the work undertaken by the Martin Centre and its predecessors were about, well, they're very similar to the building typologies in the Model Design Code as now produced for, you know, a city centre in a high rise global city versus a district centre, a neighbourhood centre, and so forth. It's not rocket science to relate densities to building heights. It's been done many times, and those examples in the National Model Design Code are a simple explanation of it, but they bear no relation to what is now happening at North Acton, which is a neighbourhood. It is not a global city centre.
Okay, how specific would you expect a policy on appropriate heights to be? How specific would you expect that to be?
I would say in a range of 10 stories. I mean, when Old Oak Park was being promoted, we had many sessions with Car Giant and Jeff Warren, and he was honest enough to say it's going to take a couple of 40-story towers and quite a number of 18, 20 and so forth, and then there'll be plenty of so-called mansion blocks, 10 to 12, to achieve the figure he was working to. And if you recall, the housing target for Old Oak Park actually dropped through successive versions of their master plan because the public said, hang on, we think that's overdoing it, overdeveloping the site. And Car Giant did reduce it each time, and they got down to whatever it was, 6,300. So within a 10-story range.
Within a 10-story range, does that mean plus or minus 10 or plus or minus 5?
I think plus or minus 5.
Plus or minus 5. Okay. All right. So the proposition is that the OPDC takes the information that it already has provided in the plan about each site and does the calculation that Henry has described and arrives at a figure, and it then puts plus or minus 5 on that figure. Now, what's the argument against doing that? Perhaps the OPDC. I think the OPDC should comment at this point.
I think the argument, one of the key arguments against that, is that when the local plan doesn't do a design for every single site, it's a strategic document, and to do so now, we wouldn't be able to take into consideration the multitude of factors that are needed to be considered for each site. I think what we've done is appropriate to the level of detail that we're able to go into at this point in time, i.e. provide capacities, indicative density range, which is set out in the local plan, general building heights. We acknowledge we don't provide building heights for tall buildings, but we do for other areas of development, i.e. shoulder heights, where they need to be responding to more sensitive locations, and where there's less sensitive locations where they can be higher. We've done a lot of work to understand the local context, where the context is changing, the sensitive locations, the opportunities where we can deliver greater amounts of density, and they're set out within our development framework principles. The example is Scrubs Lane. We're not saying that tall buildings are appropriate across all of Scrubs Lane. They're part of a very much coordinated approach to building heights with the clusters that we've identified. And where we've got other built form, it responds appropriately to, for example, the Cumberland Park Conservation Area, the Grand Union Canal Conservation Area, and where it's adjacent to less sensitive locations, i.e. railway lines, that's where we say development could go higher. And obviously we have the whole raft of development management policies in our local plan, the London plan, any other development plan policies and other material considerations to help manage that. And I think it goes back to the point I made previously around how the uniqueness of the OPDC area, i.e. there are areas which are subject to extensive change, and even the areas which have a bit more of a settled context, they're still relying on an appropriate character assessment or context assessment for future capacity is still relying on understanding the changes to those areas which are subject to extensive change, i.e. the high-speed 2 work sites or areas of intense industrial intensification.
I would simply say that when Kensington was looking at Kensal Canal side, it has modelled options. I mean, with current digital modelling tools, which again, government are saying increasingly important within the local plan system, Foo City and others, the minute a developer comes forward to think about a site, they will use such a model to produce options, which might be, 12-story mansion blocks all over, or a couple of 40-story blocks and then lower-rise housing elsewhere. if you know that you're planning for 3,200 units at Channel Gate plus a park, it is not difficult. It is not hard now to model that in a way that the public can see it and understand it in a local plan document. And as I say, we simply feel that the reason it's not happening is because you don't want to scare the horses and you don't want to alarm the public. But the reality then becomes one in which the individual planning applications go through the process, and you think it unremarkable that suddenly it's a 28-story building. Well, and so forth. And as I say, that is the struggle that we have.
Yeah, can I see that Tom Carter's has got his hand up, so let's hear from Tom.
Thank you, Inspector. I was just, giving maybe Channel Gate as an example. Obviously, we do know their own capacity. What we don't know, as Peter alluded to earlier, is the exact locations of where roads will be, where the new open space will be. So if we were to, at this point in time, have to set kind of a range of building heights, we'd have to do it for the entire Channel Gate place. And say based on the capacity, that's 30 to 40 stories. I think at the point in time where all that would serve to result in is every application coming forward at 40 stories without us having a way of controlling that. What we need is to do a proper kind of master plan approach, which is what we plan to do as part of the review. And at that point, we will know in more detail where routes are going to be, where the open space is going to be, where are appropriate locations for buildings of height, and what those heights should be. But I think if we were to do that now, it would result in a kind of it would result in a formal development that we need to consider.
Sorry, I missed that last word. A formal development that would be.
Well, we wouldn't be content with, and communities would be unhappy with. Yeah.
Okay. Right. I am struggling to understand the substance of the OPDC's reluctance to do what Henry is suggesting. I get the impression that you're worried that it might come up with a figure which you would sometimes have to exceed or sometimes could not achieve when you see a proposal in practice. Is that what you're worried about?
I suppose my point is that. Sorry, my point is that if we were to base it on our development capacities now, we'd have to apply whatever the range is to the entirety of, say, the Channel Gate place. So say we said that was 30 to 40 stories. We wouldn't have, at this point, be able to specify exactly where those two buildings are going to be. And I think the development response to that would be that every development comes forward with something at 40 stories. Whereas I think the right way to go about it is to, as part of the review of the local plan, do a much more detailed kind of master plan of Channel Gate, at which point in time we will be clearer on where the key routes through Channel Gate will be, where we provide industrial space will be, and where the park will be. We will at that point be able to be much more specific on the locations, and we'll be able to attribute each specific location much more clarity in respect of what the appropriate building height is. I think the risk at this point is we'd have to apply a new building height range across the entirety of the place, and all it would serve to do is result in developments coming forward at the top end of that range.
Yeah, I can see it seems to me that your reluctance to do what Henry is suggesting is tied in with the way you defined the locations for tall buildings as localities rather than, as Henry would have you do it, as specific locations. So it seems to me that what your concern is that if you were to specify appropriate tall building heights in the localities where you have said that they are appropriate, that you would then be forced to accept that height across the whole extent of that locality, whereas I get the impression that what you want to do is to be more discerning about allowing tall buildings at certain points within that locality, but you're not yet in a position to define where that point is.
Because it's large site with an emerging context, and we don't have a settled idea on where key bits of infrastructure are going to be located at this point in time.
Okay, I see Jennifer Robinson, who I've not been introduced to before, has got her hand up. Jennifer, would you like to introduce yourself and tell me what you want to say?
Yes, so we did meet at the previous round of inspections in person many times, and I'm working with the GUA. Can you hear me?
Yeah, I can, yes.
So I just wanted to make a very quick point as a supplement to the Robin and Henry points, which is just to perhaps make a quick link back to your previous hearing matters around the financing, and that really...
Oh, you've gone mute, Jennifer. You've gone mute. You suddenly went mute halfway through a sentence. I can't switch your microphone on for you. You're still muted, I'm afraid. Okay.
Jennifer, I'm gonna disable your mic if you can try and enable it again.
I'm sorry, Jennifer. It looks like we can't help you with your microphone. If anybody thinks they can help Jennifer, if they could phone her outside the meeting and see if you can help get her microphone back working again, that would be.
I'll suggest she rejoins.
Okay, Charlotte, if you could contact her separately, we'll carry on for the moment without her. Okay, so what I was going to do now is yes, I mean, I'm making the obvious point that the statement in the Statement of Common Ground between the OPDC and the GLA on tall building heights, it is recognised that it will be beneficial to define appropriate tall building heights through a review. That's in F, and in G, that the OPDC will include appropriate tall building heights within its development plan as soon as reasonably possible. I mean, to some extent, that does recognise, doesn't it, that they ought to be there.
It would be very helpful to have an explanation of what sort of development plan document this would be. I mean, Ealing, for example, as part of its development plan, has what it calls a DPD on a series of site allocations. Again, it's a 2013 document. We don't think it conforms with D9, but it's the type of document that OPDC may be thinking of. Well, it would be like place chapters, but with more information.
They may be thinking of it, Henry, but I've consistently taken the line all the way through the examination that policy is policy. It's not in a DPD, and that's the difficulty with that approach. But okay, so I'm making the point that it seems to me that those comments in the Statement of Common Ground imply an acceptance that there ought to be a definition of appropriate tall building heights within the plan. Now, first of all, the OPDC might like to comment on whether that is a reasonable deduction. Peter, I see you've got your hand up, so you can comment on that.
Yes, Inspector. I mean, it's essentially what we've done is taking a long-standing proposal to include building heights within our local plan. It was set out in our building statement. Yes, we did previously reference a local plan review or update or supplementary planning documents. We've since moved on from that, given the requirement in the London plan. So what we've done is work with London Plan colleagues for the Statement of Common Ground to set deliverable timeframes to include that information within the development plan. Whether that's part of the local plan review or a standalone DPD, we will explore. But the key thing is it will form part of the development plan to provide policy guidance rather than just guidance.
Okay. Right, I'm thinking we probably ought to wrap up this discussion shortly, but I'd like people's comments on my room for manoeuvre here. I think it's fairly common amongst inspectors that for a plan to be found sound, it does not have to be perfect in every way. And there are lots of examples of plans which are found to be sound enough. They're not perfect, but they are sound enough. So a question for me is this, that clearly there's a recognition by the OPDC, as evidenced by the Statement of Common Ground, that these heights ought to be there, but they're not. So I'm asking myself, does that of itself clearly makes that policy deficient until it's remedied? Does that of itself make the whole plan unsound? That's one thought. The other thought I have is that I mean, I recognise the difficulty that Tom Cardis and Peter Farnham have explained, that if you do the mathematical exercise that Henry Peterson has suggested and apply it to a fairly large area like the 18 hectares of Channel Gate, that developers would expect to achieve the resultant figure over the whole of the locality. But I'm still not convinced that you can't arrive at a range of figures with an explanation that there is no expectation that that will apply universally throughout the locality. That you can come up with a range of figures that conveys to the public and to developers what the outcome of a development might be. Because I think that's the point which I find most compelling in Henry Peterson's argument, is that a development plan is expected to give the public and developers a clear understanding of what to expect from development. And I think Henry's made the point that at the moment it doesn't in terms of heights. Things are happening fully in accordance with the plan, which are unexpected. I think that point is well made. And we need to, I think I would like to find some way of conveying to the public what they're going to get as a result of the policies and proposals in the plan. And it does seem to me that something along the lines of Henry's formula, but qualifying it in such a way to overcome the difficulties that Tom has identified, could be a way forward. Moreover, it seems to me that that could be done without going through a modifications consultation process again, because if you do it in the way Henry says, it is simply elaborating information that is already inherent in the plan. It's not a new proposal. It's just spelling out the implications of what the proposals already are. Now that's within my room for manoeuvre. I can do that without requiring you to go through the modifications process all over again. If you're simply spelling out the implications of something that's already inherent in the plan, then that's not modifying it, and I can do that. It's within my discretion to do that. Yeah, that's about all I can think of at the moment. Mr. Moulds, let's hear from you. You've probably been listening to that as I've enunciated my scope for manoeuvre. You can probably think of a few other ways I could handle this.
Well, so I was thinking of something totally separate. I was wondering if you were planning to take an afternoon comfort break.
Oh, yes.
And it might be that we could have a quick discussion offline and then come back to you more usefully after, if you are content to wait 10 minutes. Yes, it's occasionally valuable to have someone around who's not actually participating in the argument to give us all a time to think about it. Yeah, let's do that. It's 15:44 now. Should we come back at 4 o'clock on the dot? Have a cup of tea and think about the way forward. All right. So thanks very much. I'll adjourn now till 4 o'clock. See you later.
People know what to expect. Yeah. Well, I'm not sure they will.
Right, well, it's 4 o'clock, so let's resume this debate. Tom, you've got your hand up. Is that a legacy, or or are you going to speak to us?
Well, it's funny, actually, your suggestion that you arrived at just before we broke was something I was going to suggest. And we discussed it ourselves, during the break, and we'd be happy to draft up some suggested wording for you that covers what you're proposing. Effectively, it would be where we, like you say, we would identify in the plan the capacity ranges. We've identified the density range. We can draft some text that talks about, broadly what that would entail in terms of the building height range, and put that to you for your consideration.
Okay, I'm happy with that, and that would be within my discretion to adjust the modifications to the plan without introducing new content, because it isn't new content, it's just an explanation of what the existing content implies. Okay, does anybody else want to comment on that? Henry, you do, yes? You're muted, Henry.
Fully accept your point that this would not be new content in one sense, in that the site allocations include housing numbers. At the moment, they don't actually include densities, which is something we've always argued they should include. But illustrations or indications of appropriate building heights, I mean, it would depend on the clarity of those. I mean, you've suggested a formula around 10 stories, 5 stories, plus or minus, or whatever. But I think we would want to reserve our position and see what this wording was before we said we were entirely happy that that didn't need further consultation. Because if it did emerge as it's going to be 50 stories all round at Treadlegate and lots of other places, then we might be saying, well, hang on, that's a bit new. But I don't suppose that would be the outcome.
Yeah, as I say, the success of it depends on it not being new, that it just being derived from information that is already in the plan. In other words, doing the calculation that you said you have been doing, but just doing it in the open. Doing
it properly. And you might like to look, as an example, at the SPD for Kensal Canal side, an opportunity area immediately adjacent to the OPDC. That document identifies with 4 little boxes specific locations within the opportunity area where taller buildings would be considered acceptable, and the developers have come forward with 35-story buildings at those specific locations. Now, obviously, those locations are identified with some reference to suitability in terms of whether they're near or far from the canal, viewing points, this, that, and the other. I mean, that's what we would see as part of a spatial plan. Because given those sort of criteria, why can you not identify which bits of Channelgate are going to be more suitable for tall buildings? Well, I think it's an SPD, so we'll still argue with the developers that it's not policy, and that they may have to wait until Kensington revises its full local plan, which is getting on with. But as a sort of example of the approach, that's the sort of thing that we would be looking for. Okay, well, that's helpful. I think for the reasons that was it Tom or Peter explained earlier, that because they haven't defined the layout of Channelgate, they wouldn't be able to be specific about the location within it as opposed to general locality. But I'm going to leave it like this. I appreciate what the OPDC is offering. I'd like to see the suggestions. And my options are this. My preference would be if to follow that process, if possible. But if I look at it and think, well, this doesn't really work, then I've got the other options of saying that the policy doesn't comply with the London plan, but that doesn't actually make the plan as a whole unsound. Or I've got the option of saying, as other inspectors have done, that if there's a commitment to a review, then that makes it sound. But my preference would be to have something in the plan indicating
what appropriate tall building heights in the localities that the ODP has defined, what those appropriate heights would be. That would be my preference. If we can get to that point, that's the way I'll pursue it, I think. But as I have got the other options of saying it's sound subject to review, or that the policy is not sound, but the plan as a whole is not tainted by that. And so I've got three options. I'm not going to commit myself now to any one particular way. I'm just expressing a preference. All right. Okay. Well, I think we've actually covered my item 5 already. I see Jennifer's now back. Jennifer Robinson is now back online, and you probably heard that we haven't in a way moved on from where you were, Jennifer. But do you want to give me the benefit of what you were going to say?
Thank you. Yes, I think it just reinforces the direction you're going in and gives a good reason for doing that as firmly as possible. And that's to come back to the point that Robin Brown was making about how, for example, Wells House Road could end up surrounded by 3 ranges of tall buildings, each of which are 50 stories high, etc. And I think the direction of travel of this local plan has been from defining sensitive edges to now this flexibility about where tall buildings might be. And I think that for residents, there are many parts of the plan which are not flexible like Channel Gate, in the sense that it's good to say, let's not specify the height so that developers can't build 50 stories everywhere. But there's a lot of places already in existence in this area where the opposite argument could be mobilized, which is we could put a 50-story building anywhere, but should it be anywhere? And I think the residents groups are really looking for some clarity about what are good planning principles for where to locate a certain height of building, to have some certainty and confidence about that. And I would just like to make a small link back to your earlier hearings, which dealt with what you called this nexus of height density finance. And one of the reasons for the Scrubs Lane high buildings was to finance the infrastructure needed. And the temptation is that the pressure on the planning decisions comes from the need to generate more finance by having higher buildings. And I think that was well established in your earlier hearings. So I just wanted to suggest that on that basis, there's a good reason to bring forward as much information as is available on very well known areas with very clear routes, with very clear residential provision at the moment, and to be very clear about what kinds of heights and densities are expected there, because otherwise I think in the public interest is really challenging. So that was my point. I think it supports the direction that you consider going in.
Thank you for that, Jennifer. Henry, you've got your hand up. Anything more you want to say?
No, sorry, legacy hand at the moment.
Okay. And Robin Brown, I think, oh, you did have your hand up. It's gone down again. Peter Farnham, your last words.
Maybe last words, Inspector. We were going to talk about dispersed town centres.
Yeah.
I'm happy to do that verbally, or we can provide it in writing if that's useful to you. Happy either way.
No, I do want, as we're here now, I do want you to do that. I just want to make sure there's nothing more to be said on tall buildings before we move on to the dispersed town centre. I think that I've covered all the matters that I wanted to discuss under tall buildings. If anybody feels that there's any aspect of it that I haven't covered that you think I should cover, put your hand up. No, okay. And can I just check with Mr. Mools? It's always useful to have a barrister here, making sure that we don't go awry in legal terms. Are you content with the way this session on tall buildings has been handled? Do you think we've covered all the points? Are there any loose ends?
I am. Thank you. We've covered your agenda, the points raised by in the representations and everything that OPDC wanted to say. So thank you, sir. Okay,
well, thank you then. In which case, I'm going to draw the curtains on the tall buildings thing and then move on to the point that I was reminded about earlier, that I had raised the question of whether the concept of a dispersed town centre was valid, but I haven't actually arranged for a hearing session to cover that, but as we've got a bit of time now, and if the OPDC has come prepared to talk about it, then let's hear it. So who's going to lead on that? Is that you, Peter? Or is
it will be me, and then others may jump in if they want to.
Okay.
Great. Okay, so in terms of the geographic layout and location of the Old Oak Major Town Centre, we do note that it will be different to a traditional high street. It will be formed from a series of well-connected locations that are actually closer to existing neighbourhoods and communities than the submission local plan proposed. These connected locations comprise Channel Gate, where town centre uses will be focused around the existing Atlas Junction, and here there'll be an expected critical mass of around 3,000 homes across Channel Gate, which will support functioning of the town centre uses. Then there's Oaklands. So if you imagine going from Atlas Junction further south from Old Oak Common Lane, you'll meet Oaklands, and that's where 2,500 square metres of non-residential floor space has already been delivered. And then in the future there'll be Oaklands North coming forward, which will supplement that. Then going further south, we have the Old Oak Common Lane north sites, which I've previously mentioned, around providing that active frontage onto Old Oak Common Lane. So we'll be looking for non-residential uses on that site. That's to the east of Old Oak Common Lane. And then that will connect down to the park adjacent to the Old Oak Common station itself, but also the adjacent station development site, which is delivering a proposed 200,000, just over 200,000 square metres of non-residential floor space. Then as we cross over along a walking and cycling route as part of Old Oak Street to Atlas Wells, those east and west sites will provide a further 38,000 square metres of non-residential floor space, and that eventually will connect up to North Acton Station, and then further south of North Acton Station is the smaller North Acton neighbourhood town centre. So I've kind of described the connections between these locations. Primarily it's Old Oak Street, and then the new street of Old Oak Street. Sorry, primarily Old Oak Common Lane, and then it will be Old Oak Street as a new connection. Part of Old Oak Street is being constructed and delivered by High Speed 2. The other part is proposed to be delivered to the west of the station through to Acton Wells, east and west, when these High Speed 2 work sites are brought forward for development. This new connection will be entirely within public sector land ownership, owned by DFT, comprising the High Speed 2 work sites. And there is a strong prospect for the timely delivery of these sites for mixed-use development once their use of work sites has ceased. Department for Transport have confirmed in a statement of common ground their support for the modified draft local plan and the proposals within it. The various elements of Old Oak and Major Town Centre locations will benefit from PTALs of mainly 6A and B. Connections will be supported by walking and cycling infrastructure, as well as bus routes too. In terms of phasing, we recognise it will be delivered across the plan period in different stages, and each location brought forward will support the surrounding residential areas. The scale of development requires a substantial amount of town centre and cultural uses to support the residents of almost 20,000 homes during the plan period, tens of thousands of employees, and 250,000 people passing through the Old Oak Common station daily. In terms of the amount of retail or town centre uses, the rationale for a major town centre is justified in our retail leisure needs study and the addendums. These documents state that 53,450 square metres of the former A classes within the Old Oak Major Town Centre alone are required to support the development of the OPDC area. In addition to this, there'll be substantial cultural and catalyst uses, which are supported through local plan policies, in addition to the delivery of a new cultural quarter in Old Oak. When combined, these uses put the Old Oak Major Town Centre firmly within the London Plan definition for a major town centre, which is 50,000 square metres. If you refer to paragraph 3.42 of the local plan, it confirms that OPDC will in the future potentially need to reconsider the redesignation of the major town centre as a metropolitan centre, given the potential scale of the floor space required. So just to sum up, due to the excellent connections between the locations, the phasing of development, the scale and amount of non-residential floor space required to support development in the OPDC area, and reflecting the delivery of Old Oak Common Station being the largest station in the local century to be built, we consider a major town centre designation is appropriate. The dispersed yet connected approach to the form of the major town centre exemplifies the need to deliver a flexible, dynamic range of town centre uses to meet the demands of the 21st century and support the 15-minute concept, all while responding to the changes in the retail sector that have been accelerated over the past few years. A designation of a series of lower scale neighbourhood town centres would not reflect the opportunities presented at Old Oak or attract the types of uses required to reflect the scale of growth identified for the OPDC area.
Okay, thank you, Peter. Now, Henry, it was your representations that were somewhat sceptical about the concept of a dispersed town centre. You've heard what Peter Farm had to say. Is there anything more you want to comment on that?
Well, just briefly, I think we are still sceptical. Peter's run through the locations. I mean, Channelgate, yes, good place for a neighbourhood centre. Existing residential communities would like that to happen. But with all of these things, it's a matter of whether the market will deliver retailers, pharmacists, all the other things that every developer in London promises will activate their ground floors, but they don't seem to turn up. Interested in Old Oak Common Lane and active frontages, because one side has got a dip to the railway line, and we're still not clear what other sites between Oaklands and the station are seen as development sites. We don't know whether Oaklands North will proceed. Depends to the extent to which the marketing of Oaklands Rise itself is progressing well. We hear it's now sort of 30% occupied, a lot of build to rent rather than purchase. When you get to the station, yes, come when the station opens, there will obviously be some retail and other facilities around that. But we don't see these areas connecting up into any contiguous major town centre, which could compete effectively with Ealing Broadway, Shepherd's Bush, Hammersmith, and so forth. So we just think it's not likely to happen. I mean, if you look at the activation of ground floors at North Acton, a couple of betting shops, Domino's Pizza, a few fast food outlets for the student population, but we don't see that taking off as part of a major town centre. So it's just a question of views of people on the ground as to what could happen, and views of planners making plans as to what they would like to happen. So we'll have to agree to differ on that.
Okay, thank you very much, Henry. Right. Yeah, I mean, even if you're skeptical, even if one is skeptical, it doesn't necessarily make the plan unsound, because there's no proof that it won't happen. There's no proof that it isn't positively prepared. There's no proof that it isn't rationalised, reasoned. So it doesn't contradict the tests of soundness. So yes, you can be skeptical and still declare it sound. Okay. I think that probably concludes our business for today, unless anybody else has any points they want to make. Okay, so this time I will remember to thank everybody for taking part and for making your contributions. I'm going to leave you now and then some of you I will see tomorrow, which is just to remind you to book in on the different invitation for the next session, because this one is now going to close. Once again, thank you very much. Good night to you all.
Thanks all. Bye.
Bye.